With our 24th year of service to the amateur radio community just a few weeks away, you are listening to North America's premier amateur radio bulletin service and news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio. Here are the stories for release around the earth as we come to air with edition number 1244 of This Week in Amateur Radio. Representative Bill Johnson of Ohio introduces a bill in Congress to eliminate land use restrictions to amateur radio operators. Meanwhile, Representative Lasko introduces a bill in Congress to replace the amateur radio symbol rate limit with a bandwidth limit. The Department of Homeland Security Auxiliary Communications training course has been announced. The latest experiment at HAARP fired 2-second RF chirps to a near-Earth asteroid. We will tell you how amateur radio played an important part in this experiment. Yaesu announces it is discontinuing 2 of its transceiver models. We will tell you which ones. The Radio Society of Great Britain is planning events and looking for input from amateurs for its upcoming inauguration of King Charles III. The slow-scan television system aboard the International Space Station is currently offline. The RSGB announces a new exam that allows you to go straight to a full license. And radio stations shut or power down at night. Do you know why? It's because of the laws of physics. We will tell you the details in this week's report. These headline stories come to you in a moment along with this week's special features. We'll visit with Bruce Page, KK5DO, and get an update from AMSAT and what's new with all of those amateur satellites in orbit. Our technology reporter, Leo Laporte, W6TWT, will talk about how China wants to redesign the Internet with one new special feature. And he'll talk about donating that old computer you have and trying new flavors of Linux. Australia's own Arno Benshoff, VK6FLAB, will try to answer the question, what is a volt? Our own amateur radio historian, Bill Continelli, W2XOY, returns with yet another edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives. This week, Bill will take us back to November of 1963 once again. That was the year that pitted hams against hams and hams against the ARRL. Bill will be talking about the introduction of incentive licensing. And our tower climbing and antenna master, Greg Stoddard, KF9MP, will have some general antenna mounting tips for you to help you grow that aluminum farm out there in your yard. That's all straight ahead as North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service, This Week in Amateur Radio, takes to the air right now. Reporting from our headquarters studio here in balmy 50-degree Albany, New York, where they're telling us that all of these 50-degree temperatures are due to climate change and that our low temperatures are supposed to be our high temperatures. I don't know. I'm George, W2XBS.
And reporting this week from the ham shack of K2MST in the Museum of Science and Technology in Syracuse, New York, I'm Chris Perrine, KB2FAF, wishing you and yours a Happy New Year.
And reporting from our news bureau in Rochester, New York, along the southern shore of Lake Ontario, where last week we had temperatures in the single digits, and this week it's almost spring-like, I'm Dave Wilson, WA2HOY, wishing everyone a happy, healthy, prosperous, and joyous New Year.
Coming to you live from just outside the capital of New York State, Albany, New York, and Glenmont, this is Bob, W3BOO, Boo Radio.
And reporting from a cold and soggy Troy, New York News Bureau, I'm Eric, KD2, RJX.
And from Studio 1 of our Central Florida News Bureau, where the weather is going to be summer-like this weekend, I'm Fred, November Fox 2 Fox.
And reporting from our News Bureau in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where autumn is back for a short visit, I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR, wishing one and all a Happy New Year. Autumn? New Year? Now who's been messing with the calendar?
And now with our lead story, here is Chris Perrine, KB2FAF.
Our lead story this week, Congressman Bill Johnson of Ohio introduced a bill in the U.S. House of Representatives, H.R. 9670, on Thursday, December 22nd, 2022, to eliminate private land use restrictions that prohibit, restrict, or impair the ability of amateur radio operators from operating and installing amateur station antennas on property subject to the control of the amateur radio operator. The exponential growth of communities subject to private land use restrictions that prohibit both the operation of amateur radio and the installation of amateur station antennas has significantly restricted the growth of the amateur radio service. These restrictions are pervasive in private common interest residential communities such as single-family subdivisions, condominiums, cooperatives, gated communities, master plan communities, planned unit developments, and communities governed by community associations. The restrictions have particularly impacted the ability of amateur radio to fulfill its statutory mandated duty of serving as a voluntary, non-commercial emergency communications service. Congress in 1996 directed the Federal Communications Commission to promulgate regulations that have preempted all private land use restrictions applicable to exterior communications facilities that impair the ability of citizens to receive television broadcast signals, direct broadcast satellite services, or multi-channel, multi-point distribution services, or to transmit and receive wireless internet services. ARRL attempts to obtain similar relief for amateur radio were rejected by the FCC with a statement such relief would have to come from Congress. ARRL Legislative Advocacy Committee Chairman John Robert Stratton, N5AUS, noted that Congress in 1994, by joint resolution, declared that regulations at all levels of government should facilitate and encourage the effective operation of amateur radio from residences as a public benefit. He continued by stating that H.R. 9670, the Amateur Radio Emergency Preparedness Act, is intended to fulfill that mandate and preserve the ability of amateur radio operators to continue to serve as a key component of American critical communications infrastructure. ARRL President Rick Roderick, K5UR, and Mr. Stratton both extended on behalf of the ARRL, its members, and the amateur radio community their thanks and appreciation for the leadership of Representative Johnson in his tireless effort to support and protect the rights of all amateur radio operators.
Amateur radio operators around the world heard an Alaska science facility chirp an asteroid. On Twitter, ham radio users published audio and video of this past Tuesday's experiment from the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, or HAARP. This research facility is a project from the University of Alaska and is located about a 4-hour drive northeast of Anchorage, near a place called Gakona. From this remote place, home to just 169 individuals, HAARP got in touch with an asteroid. By firing a chirp radio signal in 2-second intervals, astronomers with HAARP sought to learn about the interior of asteroid 2010 XC15. It's an Aten family asteroid, a class of near-Earth asteroids that crosses our planet's orbit but chiefly dwell closer to the Sun. While 2010's XC15 doesn't pose a risk to Earth, HAARP wanted to learn about this rock's interior. The information could show how long-wavelength radio signals can probe the inside of an asteroid, which can improve models of rocks that could be dangerous. In 2029, with preparations in hand, HAARP will observe a more concerning asteroid named Apophis. The statement goes on to say this approach contrasts existing radar imaging programs, where astronomers bounce short wavelengths off an asteroid and learn about its surface. The idea is that having a comprehensive view of an asteroid will lead to stronger models about how to deflect one. NASA slammed a spacecraft into the tiny moonlet of asteroid Didymos in September and altered its motion, marking the first time humanity had intentionally changed the orbit of a space object. HAARP may be the way forward to tackling bigger rocks. The moonlet, Dimorphos, was 525 feet in diameter in size, just slightly larger than HAARP's target. Apophis, however, is twice as big.
Congresswoman Debbie Lesko of Arizona introduced a bill in the U.S. House of Representatives labeled H.R. 9664 on December 21, 2022, to require the Federal Communications Commission replace the current HF digital symbol rate limit with a 2.8 kilohertz bandwidth limit. John Ross, KD8 IDJ, is at League headquarters and files this report.
After being petitioned by ARRL in 2013 for the same relief, in 2016 the FCC issued a notice of proposed rulemaking in which it agreed that the HF symbol rate limit was outmoded, served no purpose, and hampered experimentation. But the FCC questioned whether any bandwidth limit was needed in its place. Most amateurs, including the ARRL, objected to there being no signal bandwidth limit in the crowded HF bands, and given the possibility that unnecessary wide bandwidth digital protocols could be developed, since 2016 there has been no further FCC action. In conjunction with introducing the legislation, Congresswoman Lesko stated that with advances in our modern technology, increased amounts of data can be put on the spectrum, so there is less of a need for a regulatory limit on symbol rates. I am pleased to introduce this important piece of legislation to update the FCC rules and to support the critical role amateur radio operators play and better reflect the capabilities of our modern radio technology. ARRL President Rick Roderick, K5UR, hailed the introduction of the bill. Roderick stated that the FCC's delay in removing this outdated restriction has been incomprehensible, given that the biggest effect of the delay is to require totally inefficient spectrum use on the already crowded amateur HF bands. I hope the Commission will act to remove this harmful limitation without waiting for the bill to be passed. You can read more about this legislation and see a copy of the bill at arrl.org. I'm John Ross, KD8 IDJ.
ARRL Legislative Committee Chairman John Robert Stratton, N5AUS, added that the symbol rate limit hampers experimentation and development of more efficient HF data protocols by U.S. amateurs. For all practical purposes, the field has been ceded to amateurs outside the U.S., where there is no comparable limit. Removing the restriction not only will allow U.S. amateurs to use the most efficient data protocol suitable for their purpose, but it will also promote and incentivize U.S. amateurs to experiment with and develop even more efficient protocols.
Starting on the 1st of January, hams in Switzerland will be allowed to operate on the 4-meter band using all commonplace simplex modes. The Swiss Amateur Radio Association, USKA, reported recently that their communications authorities have granted approval to hams holding HB9 licenses for a maximum operating power of 25 watts effective radiated power. Hams may operate only on frequencies between 70 MHz and 70.0375 MHz. They also have permission for the range between 70.1125 and 70.5000 MHz. Relays and Echolink gateways will not be permitted on the band, and any stations being operated via remote control must get permission from the regulator AUXCOMM CH.
In Germany, the Federal Network Agency, BNetzA, has extended temporary allocations for amateur operation in part of the 160-meter, the 6 and 4-meter, and the 13 and 6 centimeter bands. These permissions would have expired at the end of this year, but are now granted anew until the 31st of December 2023. According to a Google translation of the announcement in the Agency Gazette, 6-meter band operation is allowed in the 50 to 50.4 MHz frequency range. Class A license holders may use a maximum of 750 watts PEP, and Class E license holders can transmit with a maximum of 100 watts PEP with operation only permitted using horizontal polarization. For the frequency range between 50.4 and 52 MHz, only 25 watts PEP is allowed, but contest operation is permitted. On the 4-meter band, operation is granted up to 25 watts ERP using horizontal polarization by Class A license holders and on frequencies between 70.150 and 70.210 MHz. At the top end of 160 meters, Class both A and E license holders may use their permitted maximum transmission power operating at weekends within the frequencies 1.85 and 2.0 MHz. Contest operation on 160 meters is only allowed on these frequencies and on the weekend. Finally, holders of License Class E are given access to the 13 and 6 centimeter bands from 2320 to 2450 MHz and 5650 to 5850 MHz with a maximum power of 5 watts PEP so that they can take part in the HamNet Mesh Data Network.
The first of the year is just around the corner, and many ham clubs across the country are electing new officers and making changes. For ARRL affiliated clubs, this is a good time to check your listing on www.arrl.org and make any updates. There are a few parameters that you need to be aware of in order to make these edits. You must be logged into the ARRL website as a member. To make changes to the club listing, you must be listed as a club officer or the club contact. Only these folks can make changes. If you meet the two requirements already mentioned, you should see the Edit button on the upper right corner of the club listing webpage. All affiliated clubs and special service clubs need to do annual updates to maintain their status. If no updates are made for 2 years, you run the risk of being listed as an inactive club and not being shown in the club listings. And finally, if you are not listed as a club officer or the club contact, you can contact your section manager, your affiliated club coordinator, or send an email to clubs@arrl.org and ask for help. Some clubs make no changes, while others change everything. No matter what the situation with your club, checking your listing and making sure that contact information is up to date is never a bad idea. Further, if your amateur radio club is planning to host a convention, hamfest, tailgate, or swap fest, please consider applying for it to be an ARRL-sanctioned event. To learn what it means to be an ARRL-sanctioned event and get some ideas on how to prepare for and conduct a hamfest or convention, visit www.arrl.org/ARRL-sanctioned-events. To have your event sanctioned, complete the online application at www.arrl.org/hamfest-convention-application. The ARRL Hamfests and Conventions calendar can be found online. In addition, the Convention and Hamfest calendar that runs in QST each month also presents information about upcoming events.
With continuing COVID-19 restrictions precluding an in-person gathering, the 24th Annual Ham Radio University, or HRU Educational Conference, will be held on Saturday, June 7, 2023, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 1300 to 2000 UTC, as a GoToWebinar online video conference. Registration is now open for Ham Radio University's 17 informational presentations by experts in a broad range of amateur radio activities, including building an HF station, basic practical antennas, basics of HF operating, contesting and DXing, software-defined radios, HF digital communications, satellite communications, using Raspberry Pi computers and amateur radio, parks on the air, cables and connectors, and shack grounding. Presented in memory of Ham Radio University founder Phil Lewis, N2MUN, Ham Radio University 2023 also will be the online convention of the New York City, Long Island section of the ARRL. As in years past, participation in Ham Radio University 2023 will be free of charge with an optional suggested donation of $5, but advance registration is required for each presentation. Detailed information, including the schedule of forums and advance registration for each one, is online at www.hamradiouniversity.org/forums.
The Yaesu FT818 and the FTM400 will be discontinued. Yaesu announces the end of production of two of its models, the Yaesu FTM400 series, one of the first VHF-UHF Yaesu System Fusion mobile radios, that's been out since 2013. Also, the Yaesu FT818, that was the last Yaesu portable QRP rig with 6 watts on HF through 70 centimeter transceiver, the successor of the FT817, a very popular radio among portable, QRP, and satellite operators. Yaesu reports the reason for stopping of production of these 2 radios is the global shortage of electronic components.
The Orlando Hamcation has announced, in cooperation with the Florida Division of Emergency Management, that the Department of Homeland Security Auxiliary Communications Training Course will be conducted February 6th through the 8th, 2023 in Orlando, Florida, during the 2023 Orlando Hamcation. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Auxiliary Communications Service has a new Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, ASC coordinator, Victor Yartz, KC3 MQI. Travis Best, W3TMB, continues to serve as Commonwealth ACS officer, a volunteer position. The Pennsylvania Emergency Management Auxiliary Communications Service is a volunteer-based emergency communications reserve program that has both operational and educational components. ACS offers ongoing and technically diverse training to its members. It serves as a redundant communications resource, ready to enhance or assume emergency communications duties for governmental agencies, county, regional, state, and federal during times of actual or potential disaster, or when normal communications are either unavailable or are unable to adequately transfer traffic as needed.
6 months after publishing the new direct-to-full examination syllabus for UK license holders, the Radio Society of Great Britain is preparing to accept enrollments for the exam starting in January 2023. This exam is open to everyone, from foundation to intermediate candidates, but it was developed especially to accommodate those aspiring hams who already possess technical competence and would rather bypass the 3-tier license path. Although the direct-to-full syllabus varies only slightly from the existing syllabus, a new item has been introduced regarding aperture antennas. If you wish more details on how to book for this exam, visit the RSGB website at rsgb.org and select the option for exam announcements visible in the menu on the right-hand side of the screen.
The Radio Society of Great Britain is making plans to celebrate the coronation of King Charles III and the Queen Consort in May 2023. The coronation theme is looking towards the future while being rooted in our traditions, which the Society would like to incorporate in its celebrations. Long before there was radio, the United Kingdom had its fire beacons, torchlight relays that served as warnings of invasions in earlier centuries. As the Radio Society of Great Britain makes its plans to help mark the coronation of King Charles III and his Queen Consort next May, the Society hopes to give this ancient tradition a role as well. A number of events will be organized for the occasion with an eye toward demonstrating amateur radio to the public. The Society's coronation lead, Alan Messenger, G0TLK, is looking for ideas about what shape the special events will take, and most particularly how the fire beacons can be included as a way of honoring traditions. UK hams are being asked if they have suggestions for these events or any other thoughts to contact Alan at special.projects@rsgb.org.uk.
Amateur Radio on the International Space Station, or ERIS, has announced a list of 7 schools and host organizations selected to host scheduled amateur radio contacts with the astronaut crew on the International Space Station from July to December 2023. Earlier this year, 9 schools and organizations were selected for contacts that will take place from January to June 2023 with the space station. The primary goal of the ERIS program is to engage young people in science, technology, engineering, arts, and math activities that raise their awareness of space communications, radio communications, space exploration, and related areas of study and career possibilities. ERIS does this by organizing scheduled contacts via amateur radio between crew members aboard the ISS and students. Before and during these radio contacts, students, educators, parents, and communities take part in hands-on learning activities tied to space, space technologies, and amateur radio. ARIS anticipates that NASA will be able to provide scheduling opportunities for the following host organizations in the United States between July and December 2023. A.L. Burris Elementary School in Marietta, Georgia. Augusta Preparatory Day School in Augusta, Georgia. Bowen Middle School in Bakersville, North Carolina. Camp William B. Snyder in Haymarket, Virginia. Covenant Christian Academy in West Peabody, Massachusetts. Orangeburg Christian Academy in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and Webbridge Middle School in Alpharetta, Georgia. A total of 16 schools and organizations selected for 2023 are now working to complete an acceptable plan that demonstrates their ability to execute a ham radio contact with the ISS. Once their equipment plan is approved by the ARIS technical mentors, the final selected schools and organizations will be scheduled as their availability and flexibility match up with the scheduling opportunities offered by NASA.
On Wednesday, December 7th, 2022, 22 communication officers at the Marine Corps Communication Electronics School in 29 Palms, California, became amateur radio operators. We go to John Ross, KD8 IDJ, who has more.
W6BA, the Morongo Basin Amateur Radio Club, known as MARC, administered the exams, and 21 candidates passed their technician exam, and one passed their general exam. 14-year-old Kaylin Cossette, KN6WVD, was the youngest candidate who passed her technician exam. Retired Marine Corps Warrant Officer Robert Courtier, WO4ROB, says it was a great event, and he is excited to see so many new amateur radio operators. So what drove the officers to want amateur radio license? Well, Courtier pointed out that all of the candidates already have a background in radio administration, but not operating experience. Chief Warrant Officer Caleb Cossette, KK4KC, one of the training officers, introduced the amateur radio concept to the communication officers. Said Courtier, most of the students were curious on how to get their license, so CWO3 Cossette contacted MARC to schedule an exam session. I'm John Ross, KD8 IDJ.
Cloutier went on to say that all new license holders were offered a free club membership, but many of them will be deployed to other locations around the world and will be able to join other amateur radio clubs. He said they hope to conduct exams every 3 months.
According to a report by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Tropical Storm Fiona and the COVID-19 pandemic have created an environment that has led island residents to discover the appeal of radio communications. Prince Edward Island, also known among island chasers as Island on the Air number NA 029, has become a place to nurture new amateurs according to members of the Charlottetown Amateur Radio Club. The club's president, Bill McMaster, VY2WM, told the CBC that the group's membership has grown, especially after amateur radio's profile grew during Tropical Storm Fiona this past September. At the time of the storm, local operators were helping with emergency response through the Can-Warn Emergency Communications Network, joining the ongoing nets, providing status reports and weather updates. Organizers also told the CBC that the hams on the island expect to have another training program for licensed candidates by springtime.
And now with the latest technology news and commentary from Petaluma, California. This Week in Amateur Radio is proud to present Leo Laporte.
Let's talk tech, you and me. We're having a fun time. This is like a little user group here. Let's see what's been going on in the world around us, as if you didn't know. For instance, I think it's really interesting that a lot of different organizations are using the emergency of the virus to kind of leap on other bandwagons, hoping no one will notice. For instance, China and Huawei proposing something they call new IP, a new internet. The proposal has caused concerns, according to the Financial Times, among Western countries, including the UK, Sweden, and the US, who think that the proposal that China and Huawei made at the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, would splinter the global internet. We have a system right now, you're probably familiar with it, TCP, IP, the IP addresses you've heard about over and over again, because mysterious dotted quads, the 4 numbers separated by periods, and the whole system of DNS, all that stuff that we talk about, the complicated stuff. That was invented many, many years ago by a guy named Vince Cerf and a group of scientists at the Department of Defense, at DARPA, at private industry companies like Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, universities like Stanford and MIT, all collaborated to create this thing we use today, 30, 40 years later, we know as the internet. It works pretty darn well, if you ask me. It's working real well right now, isn't it? Admittedly, there's some burden on it. People are watching a lot more Netflix, so there's a little burden on it. But what would we do? How would we work from home without it? How would we, now you can Netflix and chill. You can't go to the movie theater, but you can Netflix and chill. That's not so bad. It would be hard to imagine doing what we're doing these days without the internet. But China thinks it's not good enough. And it's interesting because one of the points of new IP is to give, according to the U.S., the state-run internet service providers granular control over how its citizens use the internet. Oh, China, that's what you want? What a surprise. It has gained the support of Russia. No surprise there either. And Saudi Arabia. What do these 3 authoritarian regimes have in common? Well, the internet's a threat to them. One of the features Huawei, the Chinese company Huawei, has built into new IP something described as a shut up command. A shut up command. That means a central point in the network could cut off communication to or from a particular address. So basically, the internet, the way it works now, in theory, and admittedly this is what we fight for all the time when we're talking about net neutrality, is an agnostic postman that simply moves the data, the boxes, the packets around. Doesn't inquire as to what the packet contains or who it's being sent from or to. That's none of its business. Just like in the postal service or the telephone companies. None of my business. And that's how it should be. That's what net neutrality is all about. Packets is packets. No packets are greater than other packets. This system, and you can, as with all of these kind of power grabs, you can always slice it differently to make it sound palatable. Well, how are we supposed to turn off malware command and control servers? How are we supposed to shut up terrorists? We need a command like this so we can shut down the bad actors on the internet, and there are plenty. Problem is, the bad actor in this case could be Russia, Saudi Arabia, or the Chinese government deciding they don't like dissidents. And China does this all the time. All the time. Did you see the story that TikTok, which all the kids, I know the kids love it, but you might tell the kids it's a Chinese company, and they had until recently instructed their moderators to eliminate TikToks from poor people, shabby-looking people, because, well, that's not good. We don't want to see any poor people on TikTok. That's the kind of control that governments want. They want to keep the riffraff out, and the riffraff might include anybody who doesn't think the government is just not super stellar, not sufficiently deferential. The ITU will vote on this. I'm assuming this isn't going to happen, but I just thought I'd mention it. It's really interesting how, I know the bad actors. Yeah, these governments are the bad actors, and sometimes I include our own government. They're pushing through something they call the Earn It Act. Bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats both love the Earn It Act because the Earn It Act is, well, think of the kids. The Earn It Act is designed, they say, to protect children against trafficking and abuse on the internet, which is admittedly a big problem. But the way they're doing it shows they have other motives. The Earn It Act says companies will be liable for any of the content held on those companies' sites. So Facebook would be liable for anything you post there. That's traditionally not been the case on the internet. Just like the phone company isn't liable for what you say on the phone. That's not their job to listen in. And for a long time, they call it Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. For a long time, internet service providers, and still today, are protected. You're just a common carrier. You're not responsible because A, it would be impossible, and B, it puts them in the position of having to observe everything that goes on. And that is the secret of the Earn It Act. If you want to be protected, you have to make sure nothing bad is going on. In other words, you have to be able to read the content of every message, just like the phone company have to be able to listen to the content of every phone call. And that means encryption is out. Can't have encryption, because if I can hide the contents of my Facebook messages or my Apple messages or my WhatsApp messages, if I can encrypt them in such a way that Facebook or Apple can't read them, then they can't do the job the Earn It Act would require them to do. So they have to turn off encryption or, more likely, break it. Say, well, it's encrypted unless we want to read it, which isn't really encrypted, is it? Yeah, I trust Apple and maybe I don't trust Facebook, but that's not the point. If there's a key, if a key exists, it could leak out, and then bad guys could also use that. So this is why the Earn It Act is a sneaky little thing that they're, while everybody's paying attention, look over there. They're going to sneak that one through, effectively ending end-to-end encryption in the U.S. Other countries have already done that, including China and Russia. Oh, just we can't, these guys will act to take advantage of us as quickly as they can. Let's see, what else can we talk about? I don't know what you do with those old computers. You can donate them. There are charities like, the Christina Foundation that will take old computers, recondition them. Usually they'll, wipe the drive, put Linux or something free on there, and give it to charitable organizations that need computing power. Computers, especially, the computer you're buying today with no moving parts, the hard drives will wear out, but nowadays with SSDs, they're not going to wear out for a lot longer than the software will be useful for. This is the problem. The computers we're buying today, they are very, very powerful. They'll go for a good 10, 15 years without becoming obsolete, but the software gets obsolete, right? So I love the idea of reconditioning, bringing back an old computer to life by putting a modern operating system on it. And I'm not talking Windows and I'm not talking Mac. I'm talking an open source, free operating system like Linux. The reason is, and Ubuntu is the easiest one to use, especially if you're coming from Windows. It'll be very, very familiar. There are, by the way, hundreds of flavors of Linux. And for all different kinds of users. There's very geeky Linuxes, and there's Linux for novice. Ubuntu is a great kind of choice for anybody who's not used it before. Very easy to use. You install software from a store, just like as you would with Windows or Mac. With a click of the mouse, it's very straightforward. I think, frankly, the days of proprietary commercial software are fading. Believe it or not, maybe for specialized stuff like video editing or photo editing. But for the most part, how are you going to make a word processor better? And the free and open source version of Office, for instance, is as good as Office. How are you going to make Office better? How is Microsoft going to justify that $10 or $15 a month they're charging for Office 365? It's not going to get that much better. It's been done everything you need to do for years, hasn't it? Hasn't? I mean, what feature is missing? So open source software has really kind of caught up, in other words. It's kind of what and admittedly, they're building on the foundation that the private companies like Microsoft and Apple have created, copying in many cases what Microsoft Office can do. But at this point, there's a lot to be said, and you don't have to, for you using free open source software. Not only free as in it costs nothing, more importantly, free as in liberty, as in free, as in no commercial entity can spy on you, no government can spy on you. It's yours. You own it. And as companies like Microsoft and Apple and Google and Facebook get more and more in the mindset that we own you, we don't work for you, you work for us. You're the product. Then really that's how they're thinking, isn't it? When Microsoft puts a big blue window up saying, sorry to interrupt, but you really ought to upgrade to Windows 10, covering everything you're doing, everything you're doing, forcing you, even if you're in the middle of something really important, to pay attention to their ad, that's the time to turn your back on them, I say. And start using software that works for you, not software that employs you. I just think that's wrong. So go, by all means, if you haven't used it before, go try it. It's easy to try Ubuntu. You go to ubuntu.com download it. You can put it on a USB stick or a CD or a DVD. You can actually try before you buy. You don't have to install it. You just boot to that USB stick or you boot to the CD. Start up your computer by booting not to your internal hard drive, but to that external device, and you'll be able to use it completely. I mean, it's a little slow because it's running off a USB stick, but it's there, and you can see how it works. You can see if you like it. You can try a lot of different versions of Linux that way. Pick one you like. If you're a Mac user and you want something that feels and looks like Mac, there's Elementary OS that is designed to be a Mac-ish Linux experience. Free, open source, free as in money, but more importantly, free as in liberty. And I think that's where computing is going, to be honest. Anyway, I'm glad you were here, and I'm here, and I'll be here next week, and I hope you'll come by and bring your friends too as we talk high tech. Leo Laporte, the Tech Guy.
Are you ready for another trip into amateur radio history? I'm Bill Continelli, W2XOY, and I'll be back in a moment with another edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives, here on This Week in Amateur Radio.
And now with this week's edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives, here's Bill Continelli, W2XOY.
Mention November 22nd to many people in the U.S., and they will immediately associate it with the date that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. But for amateur radio operators, especially those licensed for more than 40 years, it means something totally different: incentive licensing. In a three-stage process starting on November 22, 1967, and ending on November 22, 1969, the FCC instituted incentive licensing, ostensibly designed to encourage amateurs to upgrade, but in reality a process under which most amateurs lost up to 50% of the frequencies they usually operated. Incentive licensing, or incentive punishment as some have called it, has been blamed for the demise of many American amateur radio equipment manufacturers such as Hammarlund and Hallicrafters, a temporary decline in the number of licensed hams, and bitter feelings against the ARRL and the FCC that last to this day. As we approach the 40th anniversary of incentive licensing, let's take a look at the events that led up to this controversial decision. In order to do so, we must go back to 1951. Prior to 1951, a rather simple license structure existed in this country. Amateurs had a Class A, Class B, or Class C license. Class A conveyed all amateur privileges on all frequencies, including exclusive access to the 75 and 20 meter phone bands. Class A required passing a comprehensive theory exam and a 13-word per minute CW test, which included sending as well as receiving. Class B conveyed all CW privileges on all bands and allowed phone operation on 160, 11, and 10 meters in the HF spectrum and on all VHF and UHF frequencies. Note that 75 and 20 meter phone operation was limited to Class A hams. What about 40 and 15 meters? Well, 40 at that time was CW only, and as for 21 megacycles, it wasn't a ham band back then. 15 meters was given to us in 1947 in exchange for the 14.35 to 14.4 megacycle segment of 20 meters, but the 15-meter band actually wasn't available to hams until 1952. In addition, 160-meter access was severely restricted at that time because of the LORAN radio navigation, and 11 meters was a secondary U.S.-only allocation with limited popularity. So, the Class B ham who wanted HF phone operation went to 10 meters by default. Class B hams passed the same 13 words per minute code test as Class A, but a less comprehensive written test. Class C gave the same exact privileges as Class B, but the exam was given by mail under the supervision of a Class B or higher license to those who couldn't walk the 175 miles, uphill both ways through the snow, to a quarterly FCC examination point. In 1951, the FCC reorganized the entire license structure. Class A was replaced by the Advanced, Class B by the General, and Class C by the Conditional. 3 new licenses were created at that time: the Extra, Technician, and Novice. The Extra, actually Amateur Extra, had a 20 words per minute code requirement and a written exam more difficult than the old Class A. In order to qualify for the extra, one needed to be licensed as a Class B or General for at least 2 years, in addition to passing the test. However, if you held a Class B or General license or higher, and you were licensed prior to April 1917, you could get an extra with no additional test. Technicians had to pass the General Theory and a 5 words per minute CW test. They had privileges above 220 megacycles only. Novices had a basic 20-question written exam, the 5 words per minute code test, and limited CW privileges on 80, 11, and 2 meters, as well as voice privileges on 2 meters. This was a 1-year non-renewable license. The advance was available until December 31st, 1952 for upgrades or new licenses, at which time it was withdrawn from availability. Those holding advanced class licenses could continue to renew, but no new licenses were issued. In 1952 and 1953, the FCC also dropped a couple of other surprises. Phone operation was allowed for the first time on 40 meters, 15 meters was finally opened, the 14.35 to 14.4 megacycle segment of the 20-meter band was removed from the amateur service, and, in the biggest bombshell of them all, generals, former Class B, and conditionals, former Class C, were given access to all former exclusive Class A phone frequencies. Now the conditional, general, advanced, and extra class operators had the exact on-the-air privileges. During the 1950s, novices were given 40 and 15-meter CW privileges in addition to their 80-meter segment, and 11 meters was removed. Technicians got 6 meters in 1955 and the 145 through 147 megacycle segment of 2 meters in 1959. Technicians could also hold a novice class license simultaneously. Many amateurs were unhappy with this structure. Extras complained that they had to go through a 2-year waiting period as a general or advanced, had to pass a difficult test, and yet received no exclusive frequencies for their efforts. Advanced class amateurs were upset with the limbo status of their licenses, the fact that they no longer held the highest class license, and the fact that they no longer had exclusive use of 75 and 20 meter phone. General, advanced, and extra class amateurs complained that novices should not have been given 15 meter CW. The general, advanced, and extra class hams were also opposed to increasing technician class privileges for reasons we will see in our next installment. In summary, although the vast number of hams were satisfied, a small minority had complaints, and the ARRL listened. In 1963, acting on complaints they claim they received from members and operators in other countries, the ARRL proposed incentive licensing. In an editorial, the ARRL implied that perhaps it was a mistake when the Class B and generals were given the 75 and 20 meter phone segments. The ARRL stand was now clear. Exclusive frequencies must be restored to the advanced and extra class amateurs in order to give generals an incentive to upgrade. Of course, what was left unsaid was that in order to do so, frequencies would have to be taken away from the general class hams. What was the ARRL's original proposal? How did hams react to it? What was the controversy about the technician class license that was dragged to the forefront in this battle? Be on board next time for the answers.
Achieving DXCC may be an honor, but what about the hams who work so hard behind the scenes helping other amateurs achieve that coveted status of DXCC award winners? The Southwest Ohio DX Association has launched a new program that recognizes the hams who help other radio operators achieve their first 100 confirmed DX entities. The amateur receiving the assistant must be under the age of 30. The DX Association has specifically designed the award this way to target those who help younger amateurs and ensure they continue to be encouraged and active in the hobby even after receiving their DXCC certificate. The intent of targeting this audience helping younger amateurs is to attract and retain those operators who are most likely to remain engaged in the hobby after achieving DXCC. The DX Mentor Recognition Program has the support of the Northern California DX Foundation and the International DX Association. Both groups are providing representatives on the judging committee. The award will be presented at Dayton Hamvention in May at the Southwest Ohio DX Association Dinner.
The DX Ultra Marathon for 2023 gets underway. Since it was founded in June of 2018, the True Blue DXers Club has acknowledged that long path or short path, there's no easy path to good DXing. Beyond having good equipment, DXing takes skills and practice. The club continues to nurture its appreciation for DXing, accomplished via CW and single sideband. It has announced the latest year-long operating event that begins on January 1st. This is their 2023 DX Ultra Marathon, and it's encouraging CW and sideband operation in as many DXCC entities and WAZ zones as possible. If you wish to be in the running during the 2023 marathon, you needn't join the club itself, but you are required to register. Then start making QSOs as early as January 1st and begin uploading your logs on January 15th. The club's website notes that, like any worthy marathon, this event requires operators to push their limits and make the investment in time and in effort. On the web, search for DX Ultra Marathon or True Blue DXers Club.
In radio sport contesting on December 26th, it's the DARC Christmas Contest, that's CW and phone. On December 28th, the SKCC Sprint, that's CW. On December 30th, the Yoda Contest, CW and phone. On December 31st, the Bogar Old and New Contest, that's phone only. Then on January 1st, the AGB New Year's Snowball Contest, CW phone and digital. Also on January 1st, the SARTG New Year RIDI Contest, that's digital. And on January 1st, the AGCW Happy New Year Contest. That is CW as well. And you can find a complete list of contests available at arrl.org/contest. And some upcoming section, state, and division conventions for January 2023. On January 7th, it's Ham Radio University hosting the ARRL New York City Long Island Section Convention. That is an online event. And January 20th through the 21st, the Southwest Florida Regional Hamfest hosting the ARRL Southern Florida Section Convention. That is in Fort Myers, Florida.
It is time for the weekly propagation forecast report brought to us each week by Tad Cook, K7RA, in Seattle, Washington, who reports that this reporting week, December 22nd through the 28th, 2022, saw declining solar numbers and rising geomagnetic indicators. Average daily sunspot numbers dropped from 124.1 to 96.1, and the solar flux went from 153.8 to 143.8. The average planetary A index rose from 6.7 to 17.3, and the middle latitude numbers went from 5.1 to 12.6. So let us take a look ahead to the predicted solar flux. It will be 158 and 156 on December 29th through the 30th, 154 on December 31st through January 1st, 2023. It'll be 156, 156, and 154 on January 2nd through the 4th, 140 on January 5th all the way through the 8th, and 136 on January 9th. Looking at the predicted planetary A index now, it will be 10, 16, 14, 10, and 8 on December 29th, 2022 through January 2nd, 2023. It'll be 5 on January 3rd and 4th, 10, 8, and 10 on January 5th through the 7th, and it'll remain at 5 on January 8th through the 16th. K7RA also takes a note this week that the observatory near Penticton, British Columbia, is the source for his solar flux numbers. The staff leaves annually from Christmas to the New Year. The system is automated, and we get the daily noon readings from this source. Unfortunately, the system crashed on December 24th, and no readings were posted after Christmas Eve. He wants to thank Dr. Andrew Gray, Research Council Officer at the Dominion Radio Astrophysical Observatory, for monitoring his email while on holiday and supplying Tad with the 4 days of missing data. Don't forget, New Year's Eve in North America and New Year's Day is straight key night.
Bruce Page, KK5DO, has filed his AMSAT report for this week, and as we have mentioned, CAS-5A recently as one of the newest amateur satellites. It has now been issued the official Oscar number. It is known as Fentai Oscar 118 or FO 118. Congratulations to the Chinese amateur radio group CAMSAT for their efforts in having this satellite designed, built, tested, and it is operational. They worked with local education authorities and students from 10 high schools. One of the more unique features of the satellite is that it has a VU linear transponder as well as a VU FM repeater. A lot of fun for whichever method you prefer, maybe both.
Foundations of Amateur Radio. Have you ever asked yourself a question that turned out to be a rabbit hole so deep you could spend a lifetime exploring and likely never come out the other end? I did, yesterday. What's a volt? This came about when I started exploring how to measure the power output of my Whisper, weak signal propagation reporter beacon. According to the specifications, the output level is 23 dBm or 200 milliwatts. If you read the fine print, you'll discover that the power output actually varies a little depending on which band you're on. For my specific transmitter, it says that the output on the 10-meter band is 22 dBm, or 158 milliwatts. That comes with a disclaimer that there can be some variation on individual transmitters of about 1 dB. So, on 10 meters, my output could vary between 21 and 23 dBm, or between 125 and 200 milliwatts. With my attenuator connected, the output could be between 12 and 20 milliwatts, and that's assuming that my attenuator is exactly 10 dB. It's not. Measuring anything means to compare it against something else. To give you a physical example, if you look at a tape measure, the distance between the marks is determined in the factory. The machine that prints the lines is configured to make the lines just so. In the factory, there will be a specific master tool that determines how far apart the lines are in that factory. That tool is called, quote, the standard. The process of lining up the standard with the machine making the lines is called, quote, calibration. If you build a house on your own with just that tape measure, everything should work out fine. But if you have a mate help you, and they bring their own tape measure from a different factory, their lines might not quite match yours, and the fun begins. If you don't believe me, as I've said previously, pull out all the tape measures and rulers around your house and see just how much variation there is. In my house, well, my CNC, there's a standard that came with my micrometer kit. It specifies physically how long 25 millimeters is. I also have a 50 millimeter and a 75 millimeter standard. When I compare the 75 millimeter with the 50 millimeter and 25 millimeter together, they're the same, within 1/100th of a millimeter. It's likely that it's better than that, but I'm still learning how to hold a micrometer and not have it overheat and stretch while I'm measuring. Yes, temperature changes the size of things. The point is, in my CNC world, my current standard sits in my micrometer box. At some time in the future I might want to improve on that, but for now it's fine. The standard that I have was at some point calibrated against another standard. That standard was in turn calibrated against another standard, and so on. Eventually you end up with an SI unit of 1 meter as defined by the International System of Units. In case you're wondering, it's defined as the length of the path travelled by light in vacuum during the time interval of 1 second. 1 second is defined in terms of the unperturbed ground state hyperfine transition frequency of the cesium-133 atom. I know, right? Runs right off the tongue. I can't help myself. That frequency is 9,192,631,770 Hz. Oh, this system is also subject to change. In 2019, 4 of the 7 SI base units were redefined in terms of natural physical constants, rather than relying on a human artifact like the standard kilogram. This is an ongoing process. For example, in 1960, the meter was redefined as a certain number of wavelengths instead of a physical bar in a volt in Paris. And there was also not just one bar, there were 30. National Prototype Meter Bar number 27, made in 1889, was given to the United States and served as the standard for defining all units of lengths in the US between 1893 and 1960. Yes, perhaps surprisingly, the USA is metric. Really. 1 inch used to be defined as 3 grains of barley, dry and round, placed end to end lengthwise. But since 1959 is defined as exactly 2.54 centimeters, or 0.0254 meters. Back to the power output on my beacon transmitter. Assuming for a moment that I had an actual tool available to measure this, I'd still be comparing my tool against another standard. Let's imagine that I could measure the power output of my beacon with an oscilloscope. When the oscilloscope says 1 volt per division, how do I know that it really is? If you start reading the calibration steps, you'll discover that they state you need to connect your scope to a reference, another word for standard, and that's if you're lucky. Some documents just wave their hands in the air and say something like, push the auto-calibrate button. The volt is defined as the electric potential between 2 points of a conducting wire, when an electric current of 1 ampere dissipates 1 watt of power between those points. The ampere definition involves counting elementary charges moving in a second. It's in the order of a 10 with 19 zeros. Not to mention that there's also a definition of how much an elementary charge is. You get the point. This is a rabbit hole. So, now, let's pretend that I have a calibrated oscilloscope. Let's say that our oscilloscope is calibrated within 1 dB. Cool. So, I plug in my beacon and measure. What? I'll end up with a reading. That's plus or minus 1 dB of reality. In my case, perhaps I read 22.5 dBm. That means that it could be as low as 21.5 dBm or as high as 23.5 dBm, or between 141 and 224 milliwatts. So it's within specifications. Great, but I don't actually know what the actual output power is. Another way to look at this is to use a measurement to determine if the power is within specification or not. I'm guessing that Harry already did that test before he put my beacon in the box and shipped it to me. Long story short, I'm no closer to knowing just how much power is coming out of my beacon, but I'm still working on finding a friend with a calibrated tool that might give me something a little more precise than fail or pass. You know that there's a saying about turtles all the way down? I think it's rabbits myself. I'm Ono, Victor Kilo 6, Foxtrot Lima, Alpha Bravo.
The ARIS slow scan television capability is currently not operational. The SSTV card that interfaces with the ISS computer was damaged and cannot be reliably used. Also, the ISS has recently switched to a new complement of laptops, which requires the ARIS Russia team to develop a new computer interface to support SSTV. ARIS Russia has been actively working this new development and is consulting with the ARIS International hardware and software team on these efforts. Sergei Samburov, RV3DR, ARIS Russia leader, has stated that they expect to complete the SSTV development effort early next year and launch the hardware on a future progress flight later in the year. Until then, slow scan television operations will be down. The ARIS International team will keep all informed about SSTV status through its website, www.aris.org, and its various social media outlets. Meanwhile, possibly due to a micro-meteoroid or debris strike, the Soyuz MS-22 capsule docked to the ISS has suffered an external radiator coolant leak. If it is determined to be unsafe for a crewed return trip, cosmonauts Sergei Prokopyev and Dmitry Petelin, along with NASA astronaut Frank Rubio, would be effectively trapped until a replacement could be launched. That replacement, the Soyuz MS-23 capsule, is apparently being accelerated for a potential uncrewed launch and would be remotely piloted to the ISS. This is possibly the most significant emergency situation in the 20-plus year history of the space station.
And now, with his segment on tower climbing and antenna safety, here is Arizona's own Greg Stoddard, KF9MP.
I wanted to take some time to cover some of the common topics related to installing antenna systems on towers. First, let's examine designing and installing an antenna mount for the side of a smaller tower, like the one in your yard. I have built a few homemade mounts out of scrap pieces of steel, usually built from a 3/4-inch steel pipe about 3 feet long and 3 steel bars about 1 to 2 inches across, maybe 1/4 inch thick. Material like this can often be purchased off the shelf from your local hardware store or welding shop. You will need to climb the tower to measure the sizes and dimensions of the tower, legs, and diagonal members where you intend to mount the sidearm you're building. If you do not have access to a welder, have the shop weld together the mount with the ends of the straps onto the pipe, with about a foot between the straps, which would be centered on the 3-foot pipe. This will give you about a foot above and below the straps onto which you can side mount or end mount an antenna. Pre-drill the holes for U-bolts to mount the straps onto the tower legs. Then also do the same for the U-bolts at the furthest end of the straps from the mounting tube. This mount should be set across one entire face of the tower, so it can be hinged inward during mounting or servicing. After the mount is set in place and the antenna is set on the mount, the third support strap can be clamped to the mount and tower to reduce wobble. This is not a suitable mount for a wide tower unless you intend to mount the antenna close to the tower. The most common rule for mounting distance is 1/2 wavelength from the closest face of the tower. If done properly, would make the tower nearly electrically transparent to the incoming or outgoing signals. If you draw a sine wave on a piece of paper, you'll notice that the voltage at 1/2 wavelength is 0. This is why we prefer to mount antennas at multiples of 1/2 wavelength. At 2 meters, that equals 1 meter out, or 39 inches from the antenna to the closest face on the tower. Imagine the sidearm necessary for 6 meters. At 224 megahertz, it equals about 24 inches for a half-wave distance. If you have done all your measurements accurately at the mounting site, you can assemble the entire structure on the ground and make sure it all fits before taking any of it into the air. Since my homemade mounts usually weigh less than 15 pounds, I usually carry them up the tower with me, set them in place, then bring up the antennas and feed lines. This plan would change depending upon the height of the tower, other antennas on the tower, or how you feel about carrying cargo up the side of the tower safely. Sometimes it's easy, other times there would be too much risk of touching other active antennas, which would make hoisting the mount and antenna by rope from the ground necessary. It is obvious here that pre-planning is essential to ensure safety and reduce the number of trips up and down the tower. While I have promoted the idea of wearing cargo up the tower, I'm the first to admit that limiting trips on the tower and hours on the tower are the real goal in any job I do. Limiting both man hours and movement will also limit the risk of death, which is cool. I've seen a few different methods of securing amateur-size coax to a tower leg. The most common I've seen is regular plastic electrical tape. The biggest problem with electrical tape is its lifespan. Mother Nature works to remove the sticky from electrical tape within the first half year. I've also seen cable ties used. As far as I know, clear or white cable ties are not made to survive sunlight, ozone, or Mother Nature's worst, which limit these to about 7 months or less, especially if they are flexed regularly. I think the black cable ties are the best for outdoor mounting. Lastly, I've seen 12-gauge solid wire with insulation cut to 5-inch lengths and wrapped around the tower leg and coax, then twisted. I know this type of scrap material to hold coax to a tower leg for decades with no visible sign of aging. I have also seen a black cable tie over several layers of electrical tape. And coax can change size and length during the day, so always allow for these changes. Remember, tower work at any height can easily become deadly. Money spent on books, videos, and climbing gear is well worth the investment. This is Greg Stoddard, KF9MP, reporting for This Week in Amateur Radio.
And wrapping up our news this New Year's Eve, if you're a radio fan or have merely been stuck in a car as day transitions into night, you may have noticed that you don't get quite as clear a signal in the hours of darkness. Before you assume it's a plot by reverse vampires, possibly in conjunction with the saucer people, in order to make radio listeners go to bed, you should know that it's actually the result of a requirement by the Federal Communications Commission to power down or turn off at night, and it is because of the laws of physics that the FCC has stations comply with this regulation. It all has to do with the wavelengths and the ionosphere. During the daytime, AM signals primarily propagate close to the ground, known as ground wave propagation, and follow the curves of the Earth. In the daylight hours, AM signals sent by radio stations can cover around 162 kilometers before you will struggle to hear the signal. As good as this is, at night the ability of long waves to propagate large distances becomes a problem, thanks to the ionosphere. Between 80 and 600 kilometers above the Earth, particles in the Earth's atmosphere are bombarded with extreme ultraviolet and X-ray solar radiation, ionizing them as they do so. The ionosphere grows and shrinks on your side of the planet depending on the time of day. At night, the layer reflects AM radio signals, known as skywave propagation, to a much greater degree than during the day, allowing the signals to be carried for hundreds of miles further than during the day. While this may sound like good news, it is what's known as a pain in the butt for any communications regulator out there, or people who want to listen to anything other than an incendiary mess of static. Because of this change in signal propagation from daytime to nighttime, if every AM station kept its daytime operating power at night, massive interference would result, the FCC explains on their website. In order to compensate for this, and in recognition of the physical laws that govern AM radio propagation, the FCC requires that certain stations lower their power at sunset so that the station does not interfere with others. Other stations which cannot provide the necessary protection at night to other AM stations are presently licensed to operate during the daytime hours only, they added. So that's why, thanks to the laws of physics, your favorite AM station might shut down at night. But to be fair, it is the laws of physics that allow you to listen in the daytime, so let's not get too mad at the rules which govern our universe.
This Week in Amateur Radio is holding open auditions for news anchors for the weekly national worldwide amateur radio news service. If you have a good radio voice and can reliably read provided news copy, we are looking for you. This, of course, is an all-volunteer position. An amateur radio license is not required. You must have a high-quality microphone, headset mics are not used, and be familiar with audio editing software to record and edit your finished news stories before uploading. If you would like to try out for a weekly or bi-weekly anchor position with North America's premier amateur radio news on air and podcast, please send an email to our producer, George, W2XBS. You can include a sample MP3 of yourself reading news copy sent as an attachment to W2XBS77@gmail.com. That's whiskey, the number 2, X-ray Bravo Sierra 77 @gmail.com. Be sure and use Anchor Audition in the subject line. Please include your phone number and a good window of time for a callback to discuss your submission and our operating logistics to see if This Week in Amateur Radio is a good fit for you. We hope to hear from you soon. Many of the news and information items heard on this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio have been provided by the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL Audio News Service, and the ARRL Letter, the Southgate Amateur News Service, Steve Richards, G4 Hotel Papa Echo, and the Southgate Vibes News Service, AMSAT, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, the FCC, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and AUXCOMM, the South African Radio League, the International Amateur Radio Union, the Wireless Institute of Australia, and the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, the Amateur Radio Newsline, the Rain Hamcast, Eric Guth, 4Z1UG and QSO Today, QRZ.com, the Tech Guy, Leo Laporte, the International Telecommunications Union, and various news sources on the Internet. This Week in Amateur Radio is heard on nets and repeaters around the country and around the world, on great repeater systems like WA3PBD repeater system, on Thursday evenings at 7:30 p.m. on 146.730 and 223.940, covering all of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and beyond.
With special thanks to all our weekly news sources and to you, our listeners, that wraps up this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio. If you would like to write to us, you can find everything you need, including archive editions of the news service, at our website at twiar.net. And now, for all of us at This Week in Amateur Radio headquarters and all our news team around the world, this is Will Rogers, K5WLR in Fayetteville, Arkansas, wishing you 73.